atom bomb. I want her in my wigwam. She's just the way I want her to be, a million times hotter than TNT. Baby, little atom bomb.
Hello everyone, welcome to the first episode of FoE Talk. I'm your host Isaiah, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about what some consider to be one of the best pieces of fanfiction to come from the My Little Pony community, Fallout Equestria, written by K-Cat. The Fallout Equestria fandom is a community that astounds me. It's a splinter group of a bigger fandom, niche within a niche. I don't think anyone ever really expected the phenomenon that was Generation 4 of My Little Pony. Like, no one could have predicted what would come of that. But even more surprising is just how much traction the fans and the fan content would create, especially Fallout Equestria. I mean, it went so much further than any other fan fiction. Like, there was Rainbow Factory, Cupcakes, The Conversion Bureau, Friendship is Optimal, Fall of Equestria, just to name a few. And all of these fan fictions have garnered a respectable following and inspired a lot of recursive content, like in the case of the story Cupcakes, which paved the way for a lot of the edgier, grimdark fan fictions and Ask blogs, marking a heavy influence for the direction the fandom would take. However, as big of an impact as these stories have had, they pale in comparison to Fallout Equestria. And this is the astounding part. From one fanfiction, dozens followed in its wake. I mean, we now have whole productions and adaptations of it. There is an animated adaptation in the works. There are radio plays, and if you are listening to this on YouTube, as you saw in the intro to this podcast, there is a fucking game being developed. There are entire booths and tables and panels and meetups at conventions for Fallout Equestria. There's even an entire Dungeons and Dragons styled system that's been formulated for people to roleplay stories and games in the Fallout Equestria setting. You don't see things like that in the other parts of the MLP fandom. At least not in regards to fan content like Cupcakes or The Conversion Bureau or Friendship is Optimal. And what's even more surprising is that Fallout Equestria had every opportunity to fail. As far as fanfictions go, most of it isn't that great, especially when it comes to crossover fanfictions. In my experience, crossover fanfictions never pan out well, and the writing is mediocre at best. But what Fallout Equestria does different is that instead of just a blatant crossover, it's more of this blending of the two franchises, which is the best way to do it, in my opinion. Crossovers are very difficult to pull off, because if not done properly, it comes across as too jarring and unbelievable. I think it was a very smart idea for K-Cat to have the story take place in the MLP universe, but have it revolve around original characters and not the main cast, instead pushing them into the background. I'm sure if this was written by anyone else, Twilight would have been in the lead role, and this story just wouldn't have worked as well as it does now. As many people like to put it, it's not Fallout with ponies inserted into it, it's Fallout if it was applied to ponies, which is what ultimately made it work. That and the author knowing how to write and tell a coherent story. But it's not enough to say that the author is competent or that the style of crossover helped it. This was during a time where grimdark fanfictions were all the rage and oversaturating the fandom. So based on that alone, readers could have very easily been turned off by the explicit gore and violence that occurs in the opening chapters, or by the gratuitous language, or the sensitive subject material like slavery, or even just how balls to the walls ridiculous it got. Like, MLP is bright, cheerful, animated children's show featuring magical talking horses exploring the facets of friendship. And then nuclear bombs are just thrown into the mix because why the fuck not? But despite every opportunity for the story to fail, K-Cat still managed to control this perfect storm, and to this day, Fallout Equestria remains the one piece of fan content to create the most enthusiastic fan base around it, myself included. I think the first time I heard about Fallout Equestria was during this podcast a few years back, the Grand Canterlot Cavalcade. I'd link it, but the entire archive has vanished from existence. However, you can still find the hosts out there on Tumblr, two of them being M Bullshit and M Deathmech. And if I am remembering this correctly, at one point they had a guest from the Fallout Equestria radio play. This guy voicing Steelhooves, a man with a tremendously deep voice. It was a very sexy baritone, and I'm not doing it justice by trying to mimic him. And that's what initially drew my interest. After that, I started seeing all the fan art surrounding it and the posts on Equestria Daily, and I just remember thinking, man, this is some really cool looking fan art. Like, this isn't 5 minutes in MS Paint with a DeviantArt watermark over it. This is actually some really well-drawn shit. And that's what ultimately got me reading. Personally, I think the fan art for Fallout Equestria offers some of the best content to come from the MLP fandom as a whole, with artists like PCO1, Bracinio, Kaelmon, Lucid, Vector Brony, Argo Demon, and the SFM animations he's made, and just recently with Leviru, who seemingly just came out of nowhere but has made a decent amount of Fallout Equestria fan art and just skyrocket in popularity, among many other talented creators, to be sure. And today, I'm proud to say that I have a very active role within different Fallout Equestria circles. I visit the subreddit r/Fallout Equestria and the 4chan/MLP thread general/FoE and its related IRC channel, as well as a Skype group composed of Fallout Equestria authors like Dr. Ham, Fuzzy, and Relentless, where I offer my services as an editor. And it's from talking with my colleagues in the Skype group that this idea for a FoE podcast came to be. The aim I'm going for is to sort of spark some discussion in the FoE community, to bring to light many aspects that aren't touched upon very often, and to bring some attention to some side fics that are criminally overlooked, as well as give others some recognition and feedback, because there has been a noticeable steady decline in this community. As much as I praised how great the FoE fandom is, it's definitely lost some of its former glory. I mean, first of all, there is a plethora of unhealthy behavior. Many people tend to disregard some of the fics that come out, automatically calling it shit and not giving them the time of day to provide constructive criticism. Secondly, there's a lot of moping about how nothing is going on, yet no one is really doing anything about it. There are several content creators that are regrettably no longer part of the community. Even in the /FoE IRC channel, just a year ago, the server was full and lively and constantly active. Nowadays, it's only populated by a handful of people and not much happens. But mostly, I just see people complaining, and when someone comes along to try to spark some serious talk, it gets ignored. So the aim of this podcast is to change all that. Because if no one else is gonna do it, I will. I will generate discussion. In fact, I'm currently teaching myself to draw so I can provide my own fan art to the table. And I have a lot in store for the future. But as for right now, I'd like to get into dissecting Fallout Equestria a bit. There are way too many topics to cover, and if I went over all of them right now, we would be here for days. So I'll just skim over some of the highlights, and I'll go into more detail in later episodes. Let me start off by saying that my tastes in writing comes in a sort of structured way. The first thing I look for is if it's well written. Like if it's grammatically correct, proper punctuation, spelling, technical things like that. There have been dozens of fanfictions I had to turn away from because I could not stand the use or misuse of punctuation and the slaughtering of grammar and spelling. That's sort of my first hurdle when it comes to reading. The second factor that determines whether I continue reading something or not is really subjective and kind of hard to describe, but the best way I can put it is flow and pacing. Have you guys ever read a fan fiction and it just didn't click with you? Like the dialogue felt off or the narration just didn't engage you? Like for me, this is definitely the case for Pink Eyes. Of the Fallout Equestria stories on FimFiction, this is the most viewed, and for the life of me, I just can't read it. I mean, it's technically well written, but Puppy Smile's meme dialogue just does not work for me. If it's not the poor technical writing that turns me off from a story, it's typically the flow and the pacing that stops me from reading. And those are really the only two things that determines if I read something. There is a third, and that's pure content and subject matter, but that's hardly an issue for me. I'm willing to read anything as long as those first two factors are met. I mean, hell, I read the Twilight Saga, which is a fact I am not proud to admit. If it's any consolation, I did not enjoy reading it. I just want that to be known. With that said, while I was reading Fallout Equestria for the first time, what drew me in was the slow startup. It starts with a typical introduction, setting the tone and a bit of backstory, And the story doesn't rush to get to the good part. There's this deliberate, slow pace spread evenly through most of the story. Earlier when I said that K-Cat managed to have a perfectly balanced blend of Fallout and My Little Pony, it really comes down to a simple plot device of the story that ties these two franchises together to make everything work, and that is the introduction of memory orbs. Basically, these memory orbs are used to see into the past, and ergo all the colorful, loving ponies from the series we've come to know, and to get a vague outlined series of events leading up to the end of the world. If it wasn't for the memory orbs directly connecting MLP into what is essentially a ponified Fallout, this story wouldn't have been as successful. It would have been a straight adaptation of Fallout 3, but with the memory orbs, it's still an adaptation of Fallout 3, but now with the heavy dose of MLP injected into every facet of the story. There are many problems plaguing the story, most of them consisting of trying to apply game mechanics to a written story, logical fallacies, lazy writing in certain parts, and Little Pip as a character. FoE is far from perfect, and there are many things that I personally would do to change it and make it better. Since I've started drawing, I have this goal in my head to do a sort of graphic novel adaptation at some point. And the first thing I would like to do is develop the character of Little Pip much more than how she's presented in the story. Because when it starts, we're introduced to this morally questionable character that has taught herself to break into people's privacy because she's bored? And by the end of the story, she has this whole list of morally questionable actions. The butchering of an entire town, the sparking of an all-out war, and the detonation of a nuclear bomb aside, she's made out to be this supreme Jesus figure to be worshipped.
Which I'm not saying she shouldn't be, because Little Pip is pure and righteous, and don't you ever doubt the majesty of our Lord and Savior, Little Pip.
It's just, everything in between could be restructured just a bit better. I can assure you that there are many topics to come in future episodes just on the original story alone. That is a topic that can be milked to death. There are so many topics, and there are guests that I want to have on to discuss with them because they can word issues wrong with this story much better than I ever could. And we'll also be going into a ton of the side stories, as I said, to give them much needed attention, as well as other general topics like tropes, plot themes, all kinds of exciting things. And so next week, what I'll be talking about is world building and what can be done to make the setting feel more alive. And if any of you out there have any suggestions or ideas for future topics, please let me know. I will most likely do what interests you guys more than what interests me. Before I end this pilot episode, I'd just like to give a few shout-outs. First, to Date Bio for being a total bro and graciously providing the title card for this podcast. Date is one of the coolest dudes I know, and he puts in so much effort into his work. He hardly gets any recognition for it, and he asks for so little in return. So go check out his Tumblr, look through his art. Be warned though, a lot of it is not safe for work, so be aware of that. He's constantly streaming on Picarto, so poke your head in and let him know that he's an awesome guy. Secondly, I'd like to thank Overmare Studios for allowing me to use a clip from their pre-alpha trailer to their Fallout Equestria game. Go check it out. I highly recommend playing it. It looks really promising so far, and my respect goes out to them. Game design is not an easy thing. It is an alpha though, so don't expect a whole lot. And lastly, I'd like to thank my colleagues in the FoE community for inspiring me and helping me get this thing off the ground. Darcy, Fuzzy, Captain Horse, Date, authors of The Eerie, Murky No. 7, Make Love Not War, and the things we've handed down respectively. Thank you guys for helping me along with this and polishing this piece of shit into a slightly more polished piece of shit. But ultimately, I'd like to thank Dr. Ham, the author of Wasteland Economics, for planting the idea in my head in the first place. I would deeply like to thank all of you for joining me for the first episode. I look forward to exploring many of the trials the Equestrian Wasteland has to offer. If you have never read Fallout Equestria, I recommend giving it a try. And if you like this episode, I'd like to extend an offer to you. Life can be rough and full of darkness, but remember, there is always hope. There is love in the Lightbringer. So please be sure to accept Little Pip into your heart as your Lord and Savior. Good night.
Got a doll baby, I love her so. Nothing else like her anywhere you go. A man, she's anything but calm. A regular pint-sized atom bomb. Atom bomb, baby, little atom bomb. I want her in my wigwam. She's just the way I want it to be. A million times hotter than TNT.